There are acts of state-sanctioned violence so meticulously cruel, so designed for maximum agony and public terror, that they transcend mere punishment. They become a form of political theater, a gruesome sacrament where the state reaffirms its absolute power over the body of the individual. In the long and often bloody history of English law, no penalty is more infamous, more emblematic of this philosophy of terror, than the sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was not a swift death. It was a process, a ritualized destruction of a human being designed to be witnessed, to be remembered, and above all, to be feared. Imagine the scene: a London street, packed tight with a jeering, jostling, and yet captivated crowd. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the nervous sweat of anticipation. Through this human sea, a single figure is dragged, not in a cart, but on a wicker hurdle, a rough wooden frame scraping over the cobblestones, grinding dirt and filth into the raw flesh of his back. This is the first act, the drawing. Upon arrival at the place of execution, he is not granted the mercy of a quick drop. He is hanged by the neck, but only for a moment, suspended between life and death in a state of strangulating torment, then cut down while still conscious, gasping, his vision swimming. And then, laid upon a block, the true horror begins. Before the horrified and fascinated eyes of the public, the executioner takes his knife. This is the second drawing, the disembowelment. The victim, fully awake, watches as his own organs are pulled from his abdomen and cast into a waiting fire. The final acts are a brutal finality, the beheading, and then the quartering, the butchering of the torso into 4 pieces with an axe or cleaver. This was the sentence for high treason, and its story is the story of how a kingdom defined its enemies and used the methodical destruction of their bodies to write its laws in blood and fear. To comprehend the genesis of such a savage punishment, one must understand the precarious world of 13th century England. The monarchy, particularly under the troubled reign of King Henry III, was not the unassailable institution it would later become. Henry's long rule was plagued by conflict with his own barons, who demanded concessions and power, culminating in the Second Barons' War. The very concept of the nation-state was still being forged, and loyalty was a fluid, contested idea. In this environment, the crime of high treason, an act against the king's own person or his sovereignty, came to be seen as the ultimate transgression. It was more than murder. It was an assault on the body politic, a theological and political concept that held the king as the head of the nation, appointed by God. To attack the king was to attack the kingdom, to attack God's chosen order, and to invite chaos. This necessitated a punishment that was equally ultimate, a penalty that would not only extinguish the traitor's life, but also annihilate his memory and serve as a terrifying warning to any who might contemplate a similar path. The existing forms of execution, simple hanging for common criminals, beheading for nobles, were deemed insufficient for this new category of supreme offense. The crime was an existential threat, and its punishment had to be a spectacle of total annihilation. The legal framework was still evolving. While the famous Treason Act would not be formally codified until the reign of Edward III in 1351, its principles were being established through precedent in the courts of his grandfather and father. Early English law had its own brutalities, from trial by ordeal to summary executions on the battlefield, but the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was something new. It was calculated, ceremonial, and deeply symbolic. It was a deliberate fusion of different forms of disgrace and death, each component carrying a specific meaning. The dragging on the hurdle symbolized the traitor's debasement, being pulled down from a station to the level of the dirt. The hanging represented the death of a common thief, denying him the honorable death of a warrior. The disembowelment was a punishment for the treacherous thoughts and plots harbored within his body. The burning of the entrails ensured that the seat of his treason was consumed by fire, a form of purification. And the final dismemberment, the quartering, was the ultimate negation of his identity. In an age where a proper Christian burial was essential for the soul's journey in the afterlife. The scattering of a traitor's body parts to the four corners of the kingdom was a sentence that extended beyond death itself. It was spiritual damnation made manifest, a state-enforced excommunication from both the earthly and the heavenly realms. The first man believed to have suffered this full, horrific sentence was not a prince or a powerful lord, but a man named William Maurice. The year was 1241. Maurice was an outlaw, described in the Chronicles of Matthew Paris as an educated man and a knight's son who had turned to piracy. His crime, however, went beyond simple robbery on the high seas. He was accused of acting in concert with a French nobleman, a blatant act of treachery during a period of fragile truce with France. For the court of Henry III, this was not mere criminality. It was a betrayal of the realm itself. Maurice was captured and brought to London for a public trial at the Tower. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was condemned for acting against the king and kingdom. The sentence was passed, and for the first time, the full, ghastly ritual was enacted. He was drawn on a hurdle to the elms at Tyburn, a place already synonymous with execution. There he was hanged, and while still breathing, disemboweled. His lifeless body was then beheaded and carved into 4 pieces. His head was set upon London Bridge, a grisly sentinel staring back at the city he had betrayed, while his quarters were sent to the 4 principal cities of the kingdom. The message was unmistakable. This was the price of treason. Maurice, a relatively minor historical figure, thus became the grim prototype, the first example of a formula that would be perfected and applied with even greater political weight in the decades to come. If William Maurice was the prototype, then Dafydd ap Gruffudd, the last independent Prince of Wales, was the case that cemented hanging, drawing, and quartering as the supreme punishment for the political enemies of the English crown. His execution in 1283 was a meticulously planned political statement, orchestrated by the formidable and ruthless King Edward I. Edward, known as Longshanks, was determined to bring all of Britain under his singular, iron-fisted rule. The independent Principality of Wales was a constant thorn in his side. After years of brutal warfare, Edward had finally crushed the last Welsh uprising led by Dafydd's brother, Llywelyn. Dafydd himself, once an ally of Edward before betraying him, was eventually captured and handed over to the English. For Edward, Dafydd's death could not be a simple affair. It had to be an event that would extinguish the flame of Welsh independence forever. He was to be made an example, and his punishment was tailored with a lawyer's precision to match his perceived crimes. A special parliament was convened at Shrewsbury specifically to try him. The outcome was never in doubt. Dafydd was charged not merely as a rebellious vassal, but as a traitor to the king who had once befriended him and given him lands and titles. The sentence handed down was a symphony of symbolic cruelty, each part of the punishment corresponding to a specific offense. For betraying the king as a knight, he would be drawn on a hurdle through the streets of Shrewsbury. For committing murders, specifically the killing of English knights at Harden Castle, he would be hanged. For committing these crimes during the holy season of Easter, his still living body would be disemboweled and his entrails burned. Finally, for plotting the king's death and treason against the realm, his body would be dismembered. The sentence was carried out with chilling precision. He was dragged behind a horse, hanged briefly, and then the executioner's knife did its work. His head was hacked off and sent to London, where it was displayed at the Tower of London, placed on a pole higher than that of his deceased brother Llywelyn. His quarters were dispatched to be displayed in 4 different cities across England: York, Bristol, Northampton, and Winchester. It was a macabre and powerful message. The body of the last Prince of Wales was physically scattered, just as his kingdom had been politically broken and absorbed. With Dafydd ap Gruffudd, the punishment was no longer just a penalty. It had become a fully articulated weapon of political subjugation. Perhaps no case is more famous, nor more perfectly encapsulates the brutal majesty of this punishment than that of William Wallace in 1305. Wallace, the guardian of Scotland, had become the living embodiment of Scottish resistance to Edward I's ambition. After his defeat at the Battle of Falkirk and years spent as a fugitive and diplomat for the Scottish cause, he was finally betrayed and captured near Glasgow. His fate was sealed the moment he fell into English hands. He was transported to London, not as a prisoner of war, which would have afforded him certain rights, but as a common traitor, which stripped him of all of them. The journey south was a public spectacle in itself, a parading of England's most hated enemy through towns and villages, a moving display of the king's power. Upon reaching London, he was held briefly in the Tower before his show trial in Westminster Hall. The trial was a legal farce. Dressed in a laurel of oak leaves to mock him as an outlaw king of the forests, Wallace stood before a panel of English judges. The charges were read out: treason, murder, and sacrilege against English churches and citizens. When accused of treason, Wallace famously retorted that he could not be a traitor to Edward, as he had never been his subject. The argument, legally and morally sound from Scottish perspective, was utterly irrelevant to the English court. He was there not to be judged, but to be condemned. His denial was ignored, his guilt proclaimed, and the terrible sentence was read. He was to be drawn from Westminster to the Tower, then to Aldgate, and finally to the Elms at Smithfield, a marketplace just outside the city walls. There, the full, agonizing ritual would be performed. The sentence was a political document as much as a legal one, designed to humiliate the man who had so humiliated the English army at Stirling Bridge. On August 23, 1305, the sentence was carried out. Wallace was stripped to his breeches and tied to a hurdle. The procession began, a slow, torturous journey of several miles across the rough, manure-strewn streets of London. The crowds were immense, a volatile mix of the curious, the hateful, and the fearful. He was pelted with refuse, filth, and stones, spat upon and cursed. The destination was Smithfield, a site of horse fairs and, increasingly, of executions. A high gallows and a scaffold had been erected. Upon arrival, battered and bleeding, he was first hanged. The executioner, a practiced hand, ensured the strangulation was not fatal. Wallace was cut down, conscious and choking, and dragged to the execution block. It was here that the true horror unfolded in the afternoon sun. He was castrated, an act of ultimate humiliation reserved for the most vile traitors. Then, the executioner's knife sliced open his abdomen. Chroniclers report that Wallace remained alive, his eyes open, forced to witness his own evisceration as his intestines were pulled out and thrown into a brazier. The smell of burning flesh and blood filled the air. Only after this prolonged agony was he finally granted the release of death. His heart, it was said, was the last organ to be cut out. His head was then struck from his body with an axe. The butchery did not end with his death. King Edward's vengeance was systematic. Wallace's head was parboiled in tar to preserve it from the elements, and then impaled on a spike atop London Bridge, becoming the most prominent and terrifying of the silent signals that warned against treason. It was a direct message to the Scots and to any English lord who might sympathize with them. His body was then hacked into 4 parts. His right arm was sent to Newcastle upon Tyne, a fortress city on the Anglo-Scottish border. His left arm was displayed on the walls of Berwick, another crucial border town. His right leg was sent to Perth, and his left to Aberdeen. The message was as clear as it was brutal. William Wallace, the man, was destroyed, his body geographically scattered across the very kingdom he sought to defend, a cartographic lesson in the consequences of defying the English crown. But in his attempt to obliterate Wallace, Edward inadvertently created a martyr. The savagery of the execution horrified many even at the time, and it galvanized Scottish resistance rather than crushing it. The dismembered body of Wallace became a rallying cry, a sacred relic of a national hero, ensuring his name would echo through history far louder than the pronouncements of the court that condemned him. Central to this entire grisly spectacle was the figure of the executioner. This was not a role for the faint of heart. The executioner was a state functionary, a specialist in the mechanics of death and dismemberment, but he was also a social pariah. Often, the position was filled by a pardoned criminal, his own life spared in exchange for taking the lives of others. He lived on the margins of society, feared and reviled, his touch considered polluting. Yet his skills were in high demand. A public execution was a performance, and the executioner was its lead actor and director. He needed a detailed knowledge of anatomy to perform the disembowelment while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible, maximizing the theatrical horror of the event. He needed immense physical strength to wield the heavy axe for the beheading and quartering. His tools were specialized: sharp knives of varying lengths, a strong rope, a heavy cleaver or axe, and a cauldron for boiling heads or body parts in tar or brine to preserve them for display. The executioner's task was as much psychological as it was physical. He worked before a massive, often unruly crowd. He had to be immune to the pleas and curses of his victim and the roar of the mob. The efficiency and brutality of his work were a direct reflection of the power of the state that employed him. A botched execution, where the victim died too quickly or the dismemberment was clumsy, could undermine the very terror the event was meant to inspire. Sometimes, the crowd would turn on a clumsy executioner. Conversely, a particularly skilled and cruel executioner might become a dark celebrity in his own right. Men like Jack Ketch in the 17th century became household names, their reputations built on the public agony they inflicted. The role of the executioner highlights the profound contradiction at the heart of the punishment. It was a legal proceeding, yet depended on the grim, blood-soaked craft of a man who lived outside the bounds of normal human society. He was the necessary monster who did the state's most monstrous work. These executions were not conducted in secret. They were deliberately public, designed as mass media events for a largely illiterate population. The journey from the prison to the gallows, known as the Tyburn procession in later centuries, became a major public holiday. Shops closed, and people from all walks of life lined the streets. For the condemned, this final journey was part of the punishment. For the public, it was a complex and multifaceted experience. It was, on one level, a form of grim entertainment, a spectacle that broke the monotony of daily life. Vendors sold food and drink, creating a festive, fair-like atmosphere that sat in bizarre juxtaposition to the brutal event at its center. This became so notorious that executions were nicknamed the Tyburn Fair or the Hanging Match. People paid for prime viewing spots in windows and on specially constructed stands or grandstands. The gentry would often attend, treating the event as a social outing. Yet, it was more than just entertainment. It was a powerful lesson in civics and morality. The presence of a priest who would ride with the condemned and offer a final chance for confession reinforced the religious dimension. A good death, marked by piety and a brave demeanor on the scaffold, could sometimes win the crowd's sympathy. A traitor who remained defiant, like Wallace, might earn their grudging respect, while a cowering, pleading figure would be met with scorn. The crowd was an active participant, its roars of approval or condemnation part of the ritual. For the authorities, the spectacle served a clear purpose: deterrence. The sight of a human body being systematically destroyed was intended to sear itself into the collective memory, a visceral argument against rebellion or treason. But the effect was double-edged. While it certainly inspired fear, the constant exposure to such extreme violence also had a brutalizing and desensitizing effect on the populace. It normalized cruelty and made death a public commodity. The very horror that was meant to uphold order could also foster a culture of casual brutality that permeated all levels of society. The punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering remained the statutory penalty for high treason in England for over 500 years. It was inflicted upon the leaders of the Peasants' Revolt, upon those involved in the Wars of the Roses, and upon Catholic priests deemed traitors during the English Reformation. One of the most spectacular and notorious uses of the penalty came in the wake of the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. The conspirators, including the famous Guy Fawkes, were condemned to the full ordeal. The government of King James I was determined to make an example of them that would dwarf all previous executions. The plot was seen as an act of apocalyptic terrorism, and its punishment was accordingly severe. On a cold January day in 1606, 4 of the plotters were dragged to St. Paul's churchyard. One by one, they were hanged and cut down. Robert Keyes showed defiance to the end. Sir Everard Digby, a wealthy gentleman, elicited some pity from the crowd for his youth and handsome appearance, but he too was disemboweled and quartered. Days later, it was the turn of Guy Fawkes and the remaining conspirators at the Old Palace Yard at Westminster, directly opposite the building they had planned to destroy. Fawkes, weakened from torture, was the last to mount the scaffold. He was meant to suffer the most, but in a final act of defiance, he managed to leap from the ladder with a rope around his neck, breaking his neck with the fall and cheating the executioner of his chance to perform the ghastliest parts of the sentence on a living body. His lifeless corpse was quartered nonetheless, and the parts sent for display. These executions, carried out with maximum publicity and ferocity, represent a high watermark of the punishment's use. They were a raw and visceral assertion of the Jacobean state's power in the face of a terrifying threat. Yet, even as this ultimate penalty was being deployed, the intellectual seeds of its destruction were being sown across Europe. The turning point was not a single event, but a slow, profound shift in consciousness known as the Enlightenment. Beginning in the late 17th century and blossoming in the 18th, this intellectual movement championed reason, individual rights, and human dignity. Thinkers like John Locke in England and, most pointedly, the Italian jurist Cesare Beccaria began to question the very foundations of retributive justice. In his seminal 1764 work on crimes and punishments, Beccaria argued powerfully against torture and the death penalty. He contended that the purpose of punishment was not to inflict suffering or to undo a past crime, which was impossible, but to deter others and prevent the criminal from causing further harm. He wrote that the punishment of death is a pernicious to society from the example of barbarity it affords. He argued that the certainty of punishment, not its severity, was the most effective deterrent. These ideas spread throughout Europe and began to influence a new generation of reformers, politicians, and social commentators in Britain. A growing sense of sensibility and humanitarianism began to take hold, at least among the educated classes. The old blood feuds and the raw, public brutality of the past started to seem not just cruel, but unseemly and counterproductive. The idea of the state deliberately inflicting prolonged, theatrical agony on a conscious individual began to provoke disgust rather than awe. The spectacle of the Tyburn Fair, once a central part of London life, started to be seen as a source of public disorder and moral corruption, a carnival of drunkenness and crime rather than a solemn lesson in justice. The elite began to withdraw their patronage from public executions. The ritual that had once unified the social order around the king's power was now seen as a mark of an uncivilized, barbarous age that a modern, enlightened nation ought to leave behind. The ground was being prepared for legal reform. The days of the executioner's knife and the quartering block were numbered. The decline of hanging, drawing, and quartering was a gradual process of legislative erosion and changing practice. Throughout the 18th century, while the sentence was still handed down for treason, it was increasingly common for the monarch to issue a royal pardon commuting the full sentence to a more straightforward execution by beheading, especially for aristocratic traitors. However, the full, gruesome letter of the law was still occasionally enforced. Following the failed Jacobite Rising of 1745, several captured Scottish officers of the Manchester Regiment were executed on Kennington Common. They were hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled, and beheaded. The head of one, Francis Townley, was placed on a pike in Carlisle, a final, grim echo of the fate of William Wallace. An eyewitness account describes the executioner holding up the heart of one of the victims and proclaiming, "Behold the heart of a traitor," a line straight from the medieval script. Yet these events were becoming exceptions. The last man to be fully hanged, drawn, and quartered is believed to have been David Tyrie, a Scottish spy convicted of treason for corresponding with the French in 1782. His execution in Portsmouth was a horrific affair. The crowd was so manic to get souvenirs of the traitor that they reportedly fought with the executioner over his dismembered body parts, even dipping handkerchiefs in his blood. The barbarity of the scene caused a public outcry and strengthened the arguments of reformers. A few years later, in 1803, Edward Depard and his co-conspirators were sentenced to the full punishment, but public sentiment and the discretion of the authorities led to a significant change. They were drawn on hurdles and hanged, but they were not disemboweled while alive. They were left to hang until dead before being beheaded. This became the new standard practice, a symbolic nod to the old law without its full, conscious agony. The legal reforms of the 19th century finally began to catch up with this new sensibility. The tireless work of parliamentary reformers like Sir Samuel Romilly chipped away at England's Bloody Code in 1814. Romilly successfully passed an act that formally altered the sentence for high treason. It gave the monarch the explicit power to change the sentence from hanging, drawing, and quartering to simple beheading. While drawing on a hurdle and quartering the corpse remained on the books, the live disembowelment was effectively ended. In 1820, the Cato Street conspirators were the last men in Britain to be sentenced to be hanged and beheaded for treason. Even then, the beheading was performed post-mortem on the scaffold by a man. The spectacle of public execution itself was abolished in 1868, moving the final act of capital punishment behind prison walls, away from the public gaze. Finally, the Forfeiture Act of 1870, a sweeping piece of legal reform, quietly and formally abolished the practice of drawing and quartering altogether. The ancient ritual was at last legally dead. The long-term legacy of this punishment is a profound and unsettling one. On the surface, it was a tool of statecraft, a rational, if brutal, method of enforcing political loyalty through absolute terror. It was designed to obliterate a traitor, to erase him from the physical world and condemn him in the next. Yet in this goal, it often failed spectacularly. The state, in its meticulous efforts to destroy men like Dafydd ap Gruffydd and William Wallace, instead transformed them into powerful national symbols. The dismembered parts, intended as warnings, became relics. The gruesome details of their suffering, recorded by chroniclers, fueled narratives of martyrdom that inspired future generations to continue the very causes the executions were meant to stamp out. The punishment, designed to enforce a single, monolithic royal authority, inadvertently helped to forge the separate national identities it sought to crush. The head of Wallace on London Bridge did not just speak of English power. It also spoke of Scottish defiance, a message that resonated far longer and more deeply. The history of hanging, drawing, and quartering serves as a stark illustration of the relationship between power, justice, and the human body. It demonstrates how the law can be weaponized not just to punish crime, but to project an ideology and annihilate political dissent. The evolution from the full, conscious agony at Smithfield to a post-mortem beheading behind prison walls maps a fundamental shift in Western civilization's understanding of itself. It charts the slow, painful journey away from the belief that justice requires public, spectacular suffering, towards the principle that even the state's worst enemies are entitled to a basic measure of human dignity, at least in the manner of their death. The public's transition from fascinated participants in a grim festival to horrified observers of unacceptable barbarity reflects the development of a collective conscience. In the end, the story of this terrible punishment is a cautionary tale. It reveals the terrifying lengths to which a state will go to preserve itself, and the dark theatricality that can lie behind the cold language of the law. While the punishment itself has been consigned to the grimmest chapters of history, the questions it raises remain disturbingly relevant. How does a society define its enemies? What limits should be placed on the power of the state to punish? And where is the line between justice and vengeance, between security and terror? The silent, quartered bodies of the traitors of medieval England, displayed on city gates and bridges, were meant as a final, unanswerable statement of royal power. Instead, they have become an enduring monument to the profound human cost of that power, and a reminder that the true measure of a society's civilization is found not in how it treats its heroes, but in how it treats those it has condemned.